Welcome back to Sometimes Love Isn't Enough, the Parenting Through Challenges podcast. And I am your host, Angie Grandt. And for today's episode, I want to talk about the hardest job that we ever have had or ever will have in our life. And that's parenting. I mean, I know I've talked about this before and it seems so cliche, but it really incredibly is the hardest job. And And I think one of the many things that makes it harder is that it's almost impossible. But well, one, oftentimes our kids come into this world with two parents. And as we as adults navigate through life, we invite other people into our lives and relationships change. And so as parents, we often find ourselves in this situation where we're co-parenting, whether we're talking about how we co-parent with our child's other parent and whether there's you're still with them or not, or even that discussion of co-parenting with maybe a new partner in our life, or if you're living in a generational home, co-parenting with maybe a grandparent perhaps as part of your story. And I want to talk about some key things to consider when you're co-parenting. I know that I didn't do it right. If I'm being super honest, there were so many things that I just didn't know. I knew the templates that I had seen in my life, and I knew that I wanted to do it better. I I I watched how my parents co-parented in through their divorce situation, and I I was very clear about the kind of parent I did and did not want to be. But there's so many other pieces to it that I think sometimes we forget about or we lose sight of, or we just don't really know or have that awareness of. So that's my hope today in this episode is to maybe share some things that maybe you've never thought about before as you're thinking about all of the different people that you are currently co-parenting with. I know that we often think that we want our kids at the front of our mind, right? We do what we do for our kids. Yet when we're co-parenting, we tend to lose sight of that. We wouldn't admit it, right? We would argue that we're putting the kids' needs first, but I know for myself and those in my life, I know that we often lose sight. Like our ego takes over. We want to win or we want to be the better parent. But being the better parent doesn't help empower our kids. And in fact, it may give the message to your kids that that part of them that identify with the other parent perhaps isn't good enough or isn't okay. So I want the message for today to be that when we always have our kids' best interest at the front of our mind, at the front of our decisions, we make better decisions for our kids and our family and our co-parenting relationship. So before we dig into some practical steps, well, maybe this is a practical step too, but what I want to encourage you to consider starting with is to really take time to visualize what you want your co-parenting relationship to look like. Because I know for myself, I never did this, right? I didn't have this idea to visualize what I wanted my co-parenting to look like. And because I didn't do that, I often would take actions to try to just be the better parent. I was very mindful about not speaking ill of the other parent around my kids. I um I was very mindful of that. Yet I am sure that there are words that I said along the way that could have implied that perhaps I was making better decisions or that I was being a better parent. And that message isn't the message that I wanted my kids to get. I want my kids to feel safe and secure wherever they are. And of course, as you're listening to this, if you have concerns about the safety and well-being of your kids, that's a different discussion. But I want to talk about these concepts that I want to talk about today are about when we don't get along. Because Again, like I said, when our kids feel safe and secure, they feel like they matter. And when I look at the co-parenting relationship through the lens of the 9 resiliency keys, for example, when we take action as parents to create a vision, to decide what kind of relationship we want to have with the co-parent, because even if we're not in an intimate relationship anymore, we're definitely still in a relationship and until the kids graduate and then probably long beyond that. So we're going to have a relationship more than likely, no matter what. And it doesn't have to be ugly. It doesn't have to be full of tension. It doesn't have to be full of disagreements. Of course, you and your co-parent aren't going to parent the same. And I know for me, I felt like there was so much disagreement when we were together. And so when the time came to divorce, I I had this fear that, well, now I have zero control. But the truth is, we don't ever get to control how anybody does anything. We might think we do when we're in a relationship. We might try to assert our opinions about how the kid should be parented. But we all know full well that when we're not looking, chances are that person who felt so controlled by our decisions about how they should parent are probably going to do it the way that feels best to them. And I think that understanding that that dynamic is really important because I fully believe that our kids were brought into our life and we were brought into our kids' life because both of us are the parents that our child needs to fulfill their purpose. When I look at our energy dynamics and how I understand my own unique needs through the lens of human design and look at my kids' needs and look at my parents' needs through the lens of human design, I feel wholeheartedly like we were all put here together because we all need each other to learn, to grow, to fulfill our purpose. And when we can look at our co-parent through that lens to step outside of that judging, like they're not doing things the way that I want them to, and really take a neutral look, what importance does this relationship bring to my child? Because having one parent leaves the child with only learning through that lens. And I know there are teachers and grandparents and other things, but when we think about that dynamic of what our kids experience, what our kids go through, I think that we're all a valuable part of that. And perhaps the lessons that our kids learn will be lessons about what they don't want in life, but that's part of their lesson. It's not yours. It's for them to learn about, not for you to teach them or tell them what's right or wrong. It's for them to decide. I also think as we are co-parenting, it puts our kids in a position where they learn how to problem solve. They learn how to work with challenges in a way that's healthier than fighting or being passive aggressive or whatever else might be going on. When we're able to come to agreements to support each other, even when we have different ideas about what's best for our kids, it teaches our kids that important lesson about how to work through things. It also puts our kids in a better position to be emotionally healthy, to trust their emotions, to trust their inner knowing about what's best for them. Versus when our kids are in this where they're trying to figure out who they need to be to make mom happy versus who they need to be to make dad happy, or whatever your family dynamics are. When our kids are put in that position where they're trying to figure out how to decide what's the best version of them, it's not fair to them. It's not fair to them at all. And it creates this space where kids can really question their value, question their lovability, question who they really are, how to be their authentic selves. And we know whether it's something that you're experiencing or somebody you love in your life, when we don't feel safe to be ourselves, it can be a real mess and can create so much chaos in our life. So I want to go through a couple of rules or concepts or ideas about healthy co-parenting that I learned from one of my mentors. And I'll put my own little twist on it, but that first rule is that you you hold full responsibility for your relationship, child. When you give over your responsibility for your own sense of frustration because of the relationship that your child has, you're also giving up your responsibility. You're passing on your duty to somebody else, which is teaching our kids that I feel frustrated because they did something else, instead of teaching our kids that we own our own sense of frustration. We own our own sense of happiness too. So your relationship with your child and how you feel about that and how you view that, that's totally up to you. Nobody else gets to decide that. Nobody else gets to take your responsibility for that unless you pass it on. And the same is true for your co-parent, right? They are fully responsible for their relationship. Nobody else is. Nobody else gets to decide what that relationship looks like, how they navigate it, unless, of course, your kid's safety is at risk. Different discussion, right? But you are responsible, and so are they, for your relationship. And when we can really step into our own responsibility, and when we're feeling that frustration because of how somebody else is behaving, because of the words that our kids tell us that the co-parent said to them, or the actions that our kids tell us about how the co-parent behaved, when we can take full responsibility for our own thoughts and feelings about that, it's so incredibly freeing. Because I get it, right? I started this by saying parenting is the hardest job we'll ever do, arguably. I don't know if there really is a harder job, because there isn't another job that we'll ever be so emotionally invested in. It's hard. We do this job 24 hours a day, unless you work outside of the home, and then, you get a break from your job, but it's still there, right? You're going to work and then you come home and your job's still there when you get home. And it, we're so emotionally invested. That mama bear energy that's in so many of us can make it feel really hard when things aren't going the way that we want them to. And it can make us want to fight for what we perceive as right for our kids. But it's so important for us to take a step outside of our own frustration and go back to that original vision about what kind of relationship do we want to have with our co-parent, and having our kids at the front of our mind when we make that decision. When we can take responsibility for our own thoughts and feelings and step outside of that relationship and really look at it through that lens of what do I want it to look like, we make different decisions. We say different words. We take different actions. So one of those actions that we can do is when our kids are coming to us, so this is kind of rule number 2, but when our kids are coming to us with things that we don't like, before we jump to frustration, jump to anger, jump to reacting, this can be an incredibly powerful place to empower your kids to handle it with the other parent. And I'm well aware that sometimes, depending on the age of your child, but when we can teach our kids to stick up for themselves, it not only helps to build their sense of self-worth, it helps to build their sense of empowerment, but it takes you out of the middle. It keeps you out of it, because when our kids feel empowered to say what they really want and need from their co-parent, it puts them in a position to build that confidence that they can do it the next time and the next time and the next time. I know in my parenting relationship, this is one that I had tried, and maybe I didn't do it right. Maybe it was the approach. This one didn't go very well for me, if I'm being very honest. The kids would come back and say that the retaliation was too much and that they needed me to handle things. But I would encourage you to try this first. I would encourage you to consider what you could do to support your kids, to empower them to stand up for what really matters to them, or what's frustrating them, to empower them to put words to their feelings with their co-parent. And this is true, like I said, I'm kind of jumping around quite a bit, but everything that I'm saying here, I think really applies not only to your kid's other parent who you may or may not be in a relationship anymore, but I also think so much of this applies to also if you have a new partner in your life. And and to figure out what that dynamic is, but to not always be the one to jump in and save, to not always be the one to react to what our kids are saying. Because there's also that energy dynamic too between you and your kids. And they want to figure out where they feel empowered. And part of that might be bringing their stories to you to see what happens if I bring a story to mom or bring a story to dad, what will happen next? So keep that in mind too. There are key developmental phases that our kids go through that can also create more havoc in many of these things that we're talking about too as we navigate co-parenting. All right. So the next rule, I kind of alluded to this in the beginning, but to be really clear, the next rule is to love your child more than you're angry with your ex or whoever it might be, to make choices for the benefit of your child. And it isn't about being the favorite parent or the best parent. It isn't a competition. To make sure when you are reacting, and I would encourage you to not react, that you take a pause for just a second and breathe into your heart and really ask yourself, what does my child need me to do right now? Because there's a really good chance that although maybe your emotional wave is, you know, ramping up and you feel like you need to react, that mama bear, that tribal energy or whatever you're feeling, you might feel like you need to react based on what's happening. But oftentimes when we take a pause and take a step back, that's not what's best for our kids. The next one is the next rule that has been shared by my mentor. I don't even think I mentioned who it was, but it's Dr. Karen Curry Parker. I just love the way that she broke down these concepts. So I'm sharing them with you. But the next one is about communication. You have to communicate. If you're not communicating and working to stay on the same page, and communication doesn't mean you tell them what to do. Communication means that you create situations where both parties, both parents, feel safe to share what they need for their child, which means that if if, if you are the one who's creating a space where it's not safe for the other parent to share what they need, then perhaps taking a pause. I know I had learned many years ago in a leadership training that I had learned that oftentimes when somebody is reactive to us, when they're kind of flying off the handle, while yes, they might have their own junk that they're working on, if you're in an interaction with them, chances are they don't feel safe to share in a way that is productive, that their reaction comes from a feeling of not feeling safe to share what's going on with them. And there can be all kinds of things going on in their chart. And I think, that's another one important rule is if you can know your co-parent's chart to really understand them, that can be really key too, to responding to them in a much more neutral way, where you're not imposing your wishes, your ideas, or your energy on them in a way that creates a space where it's not safe for them to share what they want for your kid, right? Because it's their kid too. This child that you're so heated about arguing about or trying to, control the other person, perhaps, it's their kid too. So understanding their energy needs, your co-parents' energy needs is really key to having effective communication as well. Another rule or idea or expectation is to have regular family meetings or even family outings. I know if somebody had suggested this to me when I was in the thick of the swamp of co-parenting and it was ugly, family outings were not something I would have even considered. But when I look back and think about how incredibly beneficial this could have been for my kids, right? The me who said there's no way, the me who just called that a swamp, that's me who is stuck in my own head and trying to be the better parent and somehow perceiving that the other parent wasn't good enough or wasn't right for my kids. So having regular meetings or outings where your kids are with both parents together and can feel safe to be themselves with both parents together is really key to helping them develop secure emotional wisdom. So another rule or suggestion is if you can't figure it out, if you can't figure out how to get eye to eye, if you're trying some of these things, get outside help. Don't keep trying to fight through it because even if you think you're hiding it from your kids, you're not. They know. Even if you say, well, they've never heard me fight, they know. If you know anything about human design and our energy, your kids know. They know what's going on. Whether or not they can put words to it, they know it, they feel it, they're experiencing it. So if you can't get on the same page, seek help. There are great family therapists out there. There are divorce coaches or counselors. There are mentors. There's so many different ways, mediators. There's so many different professionals whose role it is to really support families through these dynamics. I know it's something that I have helped families with in the past with that co-parenting dynamic, whether or not the parents are still together. Sometimes I help one parent to really understand some of these key concepts because at the end of the day, right, like we have to go first when we're in this position where we're saying like I can't stop being frustrated about the other parent until they start doing things the way I want them to, right? We don't always quite say those words, but we definitely imply that. We definitely imply that, oh, I wouldn't feel so frustrated if they would just stop doing dot dot dot. You fill in the blank. Every family is different, but when we forego our responsibility for how we're feeling, we're not taking responsibility and we're not making change, but the other parent actually doesn't have to change for you to show up differently in this relationship, challenging or not. You get to decide how you show up. That's up to you. Another important suggestion would be to make sure that when it comes to school in particular, that you're on the same page. When when we think about power struggles with our kids, there are a few things that we can't control as parents, and one of them is their learning, them doing their homework. They get to decide that. Our kids get to decide what food they put in their body, whether or not they void in the toilet. They get to decide whether or not they're going to sleep. We can't make our kids do these things, and the same is true for learning. And so when when our kids are in this space where they're feeling this disconnect between mom and dad, there's a really good chance that their behaviors are going to come out in that place where they have control, which is in school, where they get to decide whether or not they're going to pay attention. They get to decide whether or not they're going to do their homework. So figuring out how to get the right support you need to get on the same page about your kids is just so essential. Another important tip or rule or suggestion is to really focus on using iMessages. Because again, when we're putting our kids' needs first, when we're putting our desire to have a strong relationship with our kids and our co-parent, when we're putting that first, then using I statements or I messages is a beautiful way to keep that safety within that relationship. It's easy to jump to the you did this, you did that, or our child said you did dot dot dot, right? It's so easy to do that because to us that feels like our reality, that feels like what we're experiencing, but it's never helpful. And it never moves you forward when you're blaming or accusing. Things tend to get heated. And depending on your configuration, I've been thinking a lot about our emotional waves and how we experience emotional energy through human design. And imagine if you have a defined emotional solar plexus, but your co-parents is totally open. Well, if you're getting heated because things didn't go the way that you wanted to, and you're bringing in to that exchange this high intensity emotions, your co-parent is going to amplify that. They're going to be amplifying your emotions, and then you're going to perceive it like they're blowing up at you when in fact they're actually amplifying yours, if that's the way that your energy is configured. So understanding their design and also staying out of the blame game is key to to moving things forward for your kids. It it's important that you take a pause, take a step back, and really evaluate whether what you're, picking a battle about really needs to be picked. And then the last suggestion, which I find this fascinating. This is not something, one, I ever would have considered because I didn't have this heightened way of thinking about how much control and responsibility I have. But I find it to be such a beautiful suggestion is, if possible, try bird nesting. What that essentially means is when you are going through a divorce or a breakup, many of us have learned that, well, mom gets a new home, dad gets a new home, maybe one parent stays in the home, but then the child is shuffled back and forth, back and forth. They often live in like a suitcase, or, they forget this thing at mom's house or forget that thing at dad's house. The idea with bird nesting is that the child never has to leave their home, that the parents are the ones who are on a rotation schedule. So, imagine having a home where your child gets their one room. It's their room, it's theirs, it's always there. They never have to leave it. They don't have to go there, on the every other week schedule or whatever you've worked out in your family. And the parents are the ones who come and go. Maybe mom, has her own room and stays in her room for her time. And then dad has his own room or space and stays in his space during his time with the kids. Imagine how much more empowering, regulating, how that could really help kids feel like they belong and it's safe and okay to be themselves when they don't have to keep shifting places. If something like bird nesting isn't a possibility for you, another idea that can be incredibly powerful is having a shared pet that goes with a child, because a pet can be just an incredible way to help regulate our kids too. So something to consider as you're navigating challenging relationships is, what can you do to support the emotional well-being of your child through this challenging relationship? Because the relationship doesn't have to be as challenging as you're making it. And I say that with full love for you because, oh my goodness, I was there and it was ugly. It was really ugly and caused me so much mental distress, so much physical distress. Like I can't even tell you the stomach aches and the headaches and all of the things that I experienced because of my perception about how another person was causing my frustration, how another person was causing, so many issues in my home. What the heck? When I look back now through this lens of responsibility, through this lens of the 9 resiliency keys, through this lens of human design, and I look back and I think like, oh my goodness, if I had known then what I know now about personal responsibility, I would have done so many things so differently. And I say that when, had you asked me 5 years ago, I would have said, I did a pretty good job of navigating a challenging divorce, but I could have done it so much better. I could have been so much more focused on what the kids needed, even though then I felt like I really was. I could have done it so much better. So I hope that you take from this episode even just one little thing that you can do to enhance, improve, take more responsibility in whatever your co-parenting relationship looks like. Even if you're still together, we're all so very unique. We all have such unique relationships with our kids, and we all come to the parenting role with our own baggage, right? We were all parented in different ways. We all had different experiences. We've all learned different things. And so none of us come to this parenting relationship with the exact same set of rules, the exact same set of expectations, or the exact same skill set, quite frankly. And so the more that we can expand the way that we view others, the more that we can be neutral so that we can really hold that vision of what we want our relationship with our kids and with our co-parent to look like, the more that we can hold that in our heart, the better we do for our kids. And we help to rebuild or enhance their resiliency keys. So I hope that you found this incredibly powerful. And if you are ready to start really tackling a challenging relationship in your life, this is my jam. I love helping parents to really take actionable steps in their most important relationships, sometimes with their kids, sometimes with their partners, sometimes with their exes. It doesn't really matter to me. It's about you. It's about you showing up differently for you so that you can show up differently for all of your important relationships. So book a connection clarity call. I would love to see what works for you to help move you towards living more fully into you. So that's it. Take care, and we will talk soon.